Hello everyone, this is Chang at the Pacific Asia Travel Association, the Department of Sustainability and Social Responsibility. Exacerbating a traumatic human health cost, the COVID-19 is wreaking economic devastation. Travel and tourism across the Asia Pacific region are particularly heavily impacted. The biggest impacts are on our most vulnerable communities and habitats. The COVID-19 is believed to have passed from wild animals to humans through the wildlife trade, exacerbated by the unprecedented destructions of the wild habitats by human activity. Such practices can no longer be ignored. Tourism recovery then must not just be a resumption of the status quo. Instead, it is an opportunity to address underlying environmental and social issues resulting in the destruction of wild habitats. The tourism industry can also help by working with government and the public sector to actively combat the illegal wildlife trade. Indeed, this is a wake-up call to the travel and tourism industry to act now as more crises are on the horizon. Today, Pada SSR talked to Sada Tawikan, the regional manager for illegal wildlife trade of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, or WWF in short, to explore the huge impact of the COVID-19 on people and the wildlife and what tourism can do to mitigate the risk of zoonotic disease transmission. Hello, Zetsi. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. We are so excited to have you with Para in this interview. First of all, for the benefits of our audience, would you mind introducing a bit about yourself, the work you are doing with WWF, as well as your area of focus and expertise, please?
Sure. Thanks for having me. My name is Jesse Tawikan. I'm the Illegal Wildlife Trade Program Managers with WWF Greater Mekong. So basically, I cover five countries, five Greater Mekong countries: Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Myanmar, and coordinate the overall regional projects on illegal wildlife trade. As you know, wildlife trade is kind of transnational issues. It's not just one country's problem, but we have to work as a regional, coordinate effort and working together. So it's not just one country's. And before working with WWF, I was working with the U.S. Agency for International Development for 11 years. So basically, I'm looking on illegal wildlife trade, looking from the source to destination countries. So starting from Africa to Southeast Asia and this team to China, to Vietnam, to East Asian countries. So I've been working in this area for like almost 10 years already. So I see a lot of changes, a lot of the trends change all the time on the illegal wildlife trade. And I've been working with WWF for almost 2 years, basically looking at the Thailand focus and also broader at the Greater Mekong region. So we work a lot of demand reduction, working with tourism sectors, and we also working with law enforcement, building capacity of law enforcement to counter wildlife trafficking. And last but not least, we're also working with the ministry, with the policy makers, trying to change some law to follow up based on the trend that keeps changing all the time. So yeah, that's my brief background.
Thank you so much, Kundasi, for sharing with us your very rich experiences with different work about wildlife protection. So I would like to jump straight to the current situation of the COVID-19. So, with the current situation of COVID-19 as a global crisis, why does animal welfare and wildlife matter when many people's lives are actually at risk?
Sure. Actually, I'd like to broaden the question a little bit. It's not just animal welfare, but it's covering like wildlife conservation, trade aspect. Because as you know, COVID-19 is kind of spillovers from wildlife trade. So it's zoonotic diseases jumping from animals to human. And this is not the first time we're seeing this kind of situation, right? We've seen like SARS in 2002, MERS from 2012, and right now COVID-19 in 2020. So SARS starting from civet cats, MERS starting from camel, and now people speculate it's starting from bats that go to humans through pangolin. And I'm not sure the listener know that pangolin is the most trafficked mammals in the world. It's one of the delicacies that Chinese or some East Asian countries believe that it's kind of luxury, it's kind of high status food that people like to consume. So that's why it's create demands, and it's kind of push wildlife trade, happening. So yes, it's important, and we need to take a look in the terms of the suffering of the sectors that we see. This is an unprecedented situation, and wildlife trade it's not like happening now. It's happening for a very long time, and if we're not stopping, it will have a repercussion in the futures again. So we're not. And also, it's not just wildlife trade, but we have to look into the preserving habitat, because wildlife is living in their own habitat, but because of the development, because of the urban expansion, so the habitat of wildlife is shrinking. So that it put pressures on wildlife, to come closer to human and civilizations. So both the trade and shrinking of habitat that put stress on animal. That's and can see jumping of pathogen to human quite easily, because usually in like normal situation, usually wildlife is spread over in big habitat, so they're not confined to a small particular places. But if human people, we bring them into a one small confined places, you can see kind of diseases jumping around, and eventually it's coming to human. So when we take a look into this kind of situation of COVID-19, we need to look at the public health issues also. It's a holistic approach, right? It's not just wildlife conservation. Of course, wildlife conservation is important, but we need to look into the human health aspect also, and making sure that we working holistically with doctors or veterinarians, wildlife conservation, and tourism can play a very important issues, because that a lots of tourism sectors going to wildlife conservation. And personally, I went to Guiburi last week, and I saw lots of amazing wildlife. So I'm sure that this can be one of the things that tourism sector can tap into that in the future after the COVID situation is subsiding.
Thank you so much for sharing the insights with us. So what opportunities do you see that the COVID-19 crisis can actually reinforce and accelerate the acts against illegal wildlife trade?
Sure. As you know, Vietnam recently put on ban, on wildlife trade, which is very good news. Not only Vietnam, China before that put a trade ban, but both countries is on the temporary ban. So we hope that in the future it will put it as a permanent ban, and we would like other countries to follow Vietnam and China lead into these areas. And I think this kind of, of course, it's unfortunate situation, but it's unprecedented opportunities. It's kind of opportunity that we can use COVID-19 as a kind of start as a hook for policymakers to look, how we can stop illegal wildlife trade. And as I mentioned, it's not just on conservation, but it's also on human health issues. So if people understand the illegal wildlife trade that put into health and health of their loved one, they will try to reduce the risk, because as I mentioned, when wildlife coming into a very small confined space, diseases or pathogens jumping around and eventually jumping to people. So if we trying to stop that, it will reduce the risk, right? It's not seeing wildlife from different species coming together. So I think it's very important and good opportunities, not only countries, yet as I mentioned, Vietnam and China's talk about, stop or ban illegal wildlife trade, but some other countries discuss this. How can we reduce and stop illegal wildlife trade? And different countries have different levels. So how can we distinguish that and propose some solutions? That's kind of something that we need to discuss with policymakers, and how we can work on that together. Because as I mentioned, it's not just situation that happening now, but if we're not trying to stop it, it will keep happening again in the futures. So we must learn the situation and making sure that it's not going to be happening again in the futures.
Thank you, Zaxi. So if we look at like tourism industry, let's say elephant is a big part of Thailand tourism. So what should be the lesson
Yes.
learned here for tourism destinations about wildlife and animal protection?
Sure, tourism can play a very big role, in wildlife conservation. You can see, as you mentioned, Thailand is one of the countries that have very high biodiversity, rich, and when tourists coming to Thailand, lots of people want to go to see like wildlife safaris in a national park or even a marine national park. You see a lot of dugong in the south of Thailand, in Vietnam, in Cambodia. So tourism can play a big role, and that's the thing that we want to work with PARTA and other partner in tourism sectors, because like for example, PARTA, you have lots of members that be part of that. So PARTA can pass through information or some standard that tourism and travel industry can follow, the standard. And standard is something that we need to think about. What kind of wildlife conservation standard? What kind of things to do? What kind of influential activities that traveler can do? So I believe, as I mentioned, tourism in particular is a very big kind of intervention, and if we can work with them very um, smart, I'm pretty sure that we can change people kind of thinking, perception, and behaviors. For example, we are now working in 5 Greater Mekong countries, working with tour guide uh, tour guide association. For example, in Thailand, we work with Professional Tour Guide Association of Thailand. In Vietnam, we working with Vietnamese Tour Guide Association. So basically, tour guide is the one who, take tourists to many, destination. And sometimes tourists want to get some kind of exotic wildlife, like ivories or tiger part. So if we can work with tour guide, that should be the one who can, we call agent of change. So tour guide can give knowledge to tourists, not to buy those kind of ivories or illegal wildlife trade, but you can buy some other thing or do something different. But at the same time, we have to counter with some commission or tip that sometimes tour guide receive from the shop or from tourists themselves. So how can we work with that? That's the thing that we want to work with PATA or some other leading kind of agencies or association. How we can, instead of blaming tour guide as a group who bring a bad thing, how can we change them to be an agent of change? That's what we really looking forward to working with them in the very near futures.
Mm. Thank you. I strongly believe like tour guides can actually play a very important role in changing behavior of tourists, because they are like they have direct encounter with tourists, and they actually have the power to raise awareness and change the behavior. So I really appreciate what you are doing with the tour guide association in different countries. I think that's a very great initiative. Um, okay, so with the COVID-19 crisis going on, it actually has highlighted the importance of developing different safety guidelines that can protect both people and different wildlife and animals when people travel. So looking forward to the future, how do you actually envision the future of wildlife tourism and conservation in a post-COVID-19 world?
Yeah, wildlife tourism is one of the big and bright spot, for tourism. People usually in the past look about culture, tradition, or shopping, but wildlife is not a big highlight comparing to others. So I think we can promote more sustainable tourism, ecotourism. We can work with local villages or communities. Like if you talk about wildlife in landscape areas, we can work with communities surrounding there. We can use them as a tour guide, local tour guide, or open as a homestay for people to get different experience. So we can promote more than the current practice that we have, and we can train those local tourism, to be, as I mentioned, an agent of change. So we can train them for them to understand and influence their client. When people coming to their tour, they can provide knowledge, be responsible guide tour, for example. So we can do a lot in the futures, especially on sustainable tourism sectors, which I don't think we do much in the past, but a big room to grow.
Yeah, that's why we actually talked earlier about the different opportunities that COVID-19 can bring, and it's actually an opportunity that we can strengthen the relationship and connection between tourism sector and wildlife protection sector, like what you guys are doing. So I really appreciate
Sure.
it. Yeah. With the COVID-19 going on, the lack of tourism revenue at a lot of like wildlife sanctuaries or wild animal camps has been dropped down and has resulted in like parks start losing their employment or raising a lot of a threat to the anti-poaching patrols and also wildlife monitoring. So how can the tourism industry contribute to like building back a better future for wildlife conservation?
Sure. I think tourism, as I mentioned, play a very big roles in wildlife conservation. And we are working, as I mentioned, one of the things that WWF is working is to build capacity of wildlife enforcement network. It's a group that working on wildlife conservation and wildlife trafficking, anti-wildlife trafficking. So we work with Department of like forestry, national park, custom, police, do some kind of patrolling for them to making sure that there is no poaching, as you mentioned, because of lockdown. So people are ordered to stay at home. So that's give opportunity for poacher to go to any areas and poach wildlife. So we working with wildlife enforcement network groups to patrol the areas just to make sure that there is no poaching situation or not exacerbate that because of the lockdown situation. And moving forward in the futures, we talk about how tourism and travel industry can be part of these areas. So we're thinking about open some national park for wildlife conservation, sustainable tourism for people to go take a look at that areas, and for like wildlife conservation or any law enforcement can take tourists in some areas for them to experience some kind of natures and wildlife and tourism kind of new opportunities in national park.